Welcome to Bold Voices, Good Yarns. I'm your host, Ian Henzel. Behind every book lies an author's life story. So join me on an interactive journey as we step between the pages to explore how an author's life and their experiences have shaped the stories that we cherish and love. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of joe or a cocktail, and join me as we step between the pages. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ian Henzel, and thank you for joining us today on Bold Voices, Good Yarns. And today we are going to be diving between the pages with Sandra Butler, who has a new memoir out, Leaving Home at 83. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi. So something that's a little bit different about you than some of our other guests that we've had is, how old are you now, Sandra?
86.
So you're 86. And what year were you born?
1938.
1938. So that's pre-World War II, which is a bit different from some of our other guests who were born in maybe the late 40s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and dare I say 2000s. So the world you grew up in is very different from the world we live in today, or that even somebody growing up like myself in the 50s. Do you share a bit about how your childhood and your upbringing influenced your worldview?
Well, sure. My childhood and my upbringing influenced not only my worldview, but more importantly, I think my relationship to language, to words. I grew up in a emotionally autistic family. There was no conversation. The first time and my favorite times to listen to conversation were the soap operas, where people talked to each other, told each other what their days were like. Kids talked to each other. Grown-ups were interested in kids. There was none of that in my family. And silence was ominous and dangerous. And I immersed myself as soon as I got my first library card in words because I was hungry for words. And even though I couldn't hear them, the sound of them on the page comforted me and moved me into a world larger than the world that was my nuclear family. Most of my early reading was in the 1940s, and most of that time for white middle-class girls were books that taught you how to be an adult. And I apprenticed myself to those books because I wanted to be a good adult. I just didn't know how to be one. I didn't want to be one like my nuclear family, but that was really all I knew. There's another detail probably to say. I grew to 6 feet when I was 13. So that not only was I in the family I was in, but I had a body unlike anybody's body. And I think that when I look back on those years, that led me to Ralph Ellison and early James Baldwin, where people saw your outside and evaluated your outside. And they gave voice with great eloquence to these unformed, undeveloped feelings that I had about being outside, not fitting in, not belonging. I didn't start to write my own words until I was married, divorced, and then making a life as an autonomous woman with 2 children. And my writing began very much as an outgrowth of the silence of my childhood and how scarring that was. So the first book that I wrote when I was in my 30s was called Conspiracy of Silence, The Trauma of Incest.
And what year would that have been?
1978. Actually,
So that
I just turned 40 when that book was published.
Conspiracy of Silence.
The Trauma of Incest. And the reason that subject drew me was not because I had had any kind of violation myself, but because it was unsaid. And I had this sense of urgency that has stayed with me all my life to say everything that has never been said. And
There's a lot there to unpack. And I keep going back, and I'm still on you listen to soap operas, which for our listeners and viewers would have been radio.
Yeah.
So It would have been radio. And I think it's important for people to understand. I think understanding, we talk about our lives, but when I talk to people, I always like, that when it happened is almost as important as what
Absolutely.
happened, because the year and what's going on around you.
Exactly.
And you said you were married. You're now a lesbian. So when was it that you got married?
I got married at 18 because I didn't know how else to leave home. I wasn't brave enough to leave home without getting married. But to answer to respond to the observation you just made, my second book was written in 1988, called Cancer in Two Voices. And you're absolutely right. It was the time in which it was written. It was in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. I was living in a long-term lesbian relationship in San Francisco, and death was everywhere. It was part of our culture. It was part of our world, and my partner was dying at that time. And that was the second book that I wrote about what it was as a lesbian in that cultural moment to prepare myself for her death. And then we wrote alternating chapters, and then she wrote about her preparing to die. So
alternating chapters. One chapter was your voice and perspective. One chapter was your partner's.
Yeah. And again, nothing was written about either the politics of breast cancer or the unique and distinct ways in which lesbians might navigate cancer and the way that we did. We also made a film, and I traveled a lot with that in the lesbian community around the country during the time that there was a much less covered epidemic, which was stage 1 breast cancer of women. It's very widespread. Again, the third book was a book about mothering middle-aged daughters, because we're still mothering, but they're middle-aged and we're old. So the dynamics change, power relations change, dependency changes. And that was not being said. That's at the heart of everything, is to say the stuff that's still in the shadows, that's still a secret. That's why I like to be introduced as old. That's my identity. I am old, I am Jewish, and I am queer. I've been many things in my life, but at this time in my life, that's the heart of who I am. The last 2 books I've written in my own voice as an old woman, particularly leaving home, has found its place with Rattling Good Yarns, because it's about the stories, the voices that need to be told, the words that need to be said, the words I hungered for as a little girl.
Many of our guests write fiction, and from all the books you're describing, you write nonfiction, and you write about your life, you write about things. And you were just saying in the silence that, so do you feel that your early years and growing up, and you were married, you got married to move out of the house, that this whole being quiet, that you write nonfiction to get to fight against silence?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know that I would use the word fight against so much as inviting people to their own stories, to the words that they haven't yet been able to say. Much of my life was spent in the violence against movement years, and then politics of women's health care. And there's so much that women are unable to say. There are so many words that are caught in their throat that would release so much for them if they could say it. So I think about my writing as an invitation to their own silences.
Did that inspire you to write Leaving Home at 83? which is a memoir about your leaving the San Francisco Bay Area, moving into senior living in Phoenix, giving up. You still had autonomy, but giving up a level of autonomy.
Right.
But we're always coming out. And that whole new environment where you were coming out as Jewish again, coming out as lesbian. Why did you write Leaving Home at 83?
Why did I write it? I wrote it because while it's a Sandy story, it's also a much larger story about old women navigating increasing dependency, trying to hold on to autonomy, recalibrating relationships with the people who are going to take them through to the end of their lives in ways that are honest and clear. So my story is a very particular autobiographical example of that dread thing that old people always have, which is not wanting to become a burden on your kids, making decisions hopefully to avoid that. And of course, there is no avoiding that. And how do you age honestly, respectfully, mutually, collaboratively? And this book chronicles all the mistakes that I made until I was able. It's a book about mistakes, absolutely. And I emerged from the book understanding myself and my relationship with my daughters much more deeply and much more clearly, and things that needed to get said that we all need to say as we're aging and as the vessel or the mind is becoming more vulnerable. There are words that need to be said. And I see that as not inspiration, more as my mission. All my books.
Well, there's so much written for younger people.
Mm-hmm.
There are all these things about, we tend to focus, and especially in the queer community, the LGBT community,
Mm-hmm.
there's an invisibility of seniors.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all these support materials for coming out and getting started.
Yep.
But there's really nothing out there and it's not like, you turn a certain age and I know exactly what it's like to be 86. There are no handbooks out there.
No.
And there is a lack of material about, being gay and gray.
Yep.
Out there, because our focus is so much on the young. Do you see ageism in the queer community?
Well, thank you for saying that word, because I remember when I was living in the Castro, where I lived for a dozen years, in my 40s, there were two places in the Castro called wrinkle rooms. And those were the bars that gay men over 40 were
I remember that
relegated
when I
to.
came out, wrinkle rooms.
And so I think that it's fair to say that we have internalized the ageism of the dominant culture in our community. It's in the air, it's in the culture, it's everywhere. Why would it not be internalized in the ways that women internalize sexism? It's where do you put your attention and your focus? And why is that where your attention and focus is? So absolutely, it's an ageism in our community. And I am now living in Tucson, Arizona, that has begun by, as so many of our institutions have been begun by, a lesbian called Senior Pride. And it's a community for LGBTQ elders. And it's cultural, it's medical, it's resources, it's support services, it's community. And I have what most old LGBT people don't have unless they live in a reasonably urban environment where there are communities. So it's political work that's ahead of the next generation to do, and it may not happen until they're in their own aging.
Well, Sandra, we've got so much here, and probably material for another podcast. I want to ask you a question that I ask all of our guests, And, and in the world of books, authors create books. If you had a choice of moving into and living in a book, what book would you live in?
The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. He's the person I was thinking of. If I could find a Black woman who came to mind in the same way that Baldwin does. And it's Baldwin because I found him when I was in my 20s, and he helped me be brave in my life. He helped me be honest on the page. He helped me remember how love is at the center of everything. It would be that one.
Well, so a continuation of honesty and being authentic. So that's where you'd live. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. And I wish we had more time, but I want to thank you for joining us today on Bold Voices, Good Yarns. And once again, for everyone, Sandra Butler's new book is Leaving Home at 83. It's a memoir about her moving into senior living at the age of 83. And it is warm and it's funny, and it will appeal to readers of any age. It's published by Rattling Good Yarns Press, and there'll be links to buy it in the show notes. So once again, Sandra or Sandy, thank you for joining us today. And we're going to have you on the show again. Our guest today on Bold Voices, Good Yarns was Sandra Butler. You can learn more about Sandra Butler and her books by going to her website. Just go to sandrabutler.net. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again real soon. You've been listening to Bold Voices, Good Yarns, brought to you by Rattling Good Yarns Press. Subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube, and follow us on social media. Search for Rattling Good Yarns Press. Also, visit our website at rattlinggoodyarns.com, where you can find great reads and interesting articles about the world of books. See you soon!